Hey, everybody. So, I am really excited today to talk to you about the biology aspect when I talk about the the riverbed, right? How our thoughts, emotions, and actions are like the water of the river, and that the riverbed itself, right, is built up of kind of our underlying core beliefs, our biology, and then I'll bring in another element here in the near future to kind of round that analogy out for you, so you have a better understanding of how we are who we are, how to kind of better influence some of the things you want to be, whether those are action based habits, whether they're thought based patterns, right? Whether they're emotional based patterns or action based patterns. And so, just for anyone who's new, I'm not a biologist. I'm not a psychologist or doctor, and my goal is to hopefully communicate some of this information into a way that is easier for you to consume, isn't as science and I've read a lot of books. I've listened to a lot of books. I've studied a lot of from a lot of people who aren't what I would say very captivating. It's great to listen to if you're trying to go to bed, basically, right? So it's very scientific and very dry in a lot of cases. And so I am going to provide you with some references of people that, if you want to follow up on some of the things that I share with you and dive deeper, that you can, reach out to those people. You can follow them. You can kind of consume some of the information they've created because I think it's extremely valuable. So with that, I'll go ahead and um, share my screen here with you. So today, we're going to be talking about biology, right? Basically, everything that makes us who we are, from the brain to the nervous system, every aspect of who we are as a person. And to tie it back into the riverbed concept, like we talked about, all the little tributaries, all those little patterns that have been created, right? Your general daily kind of habits to all those small little things of thought processes, all those little patterns are generally guided by underlying core beliefs, beliefs about yourself, about the world, about a number of different things, as well as your biology and survival instincts that are part of that biology that have been passed through kind of from an evolutionary standpoint, that have been passed down to you. So it's really important to kind of understand those things, because why you sometimes have the reactions that you have, this will come into play more there as well. So I think it's really important that you understand this aspect of it. Once you have this understanding, it gives you such a deeper level of awareness of why we do some of the things that we do, right? And also how to influence those and change those in a more effective way. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what's called the reptilian brain. Some people may refer to it as the old brain, but it's basically the instinctual brain. And a lot of people, even myself, will call it I've called it the crappy reptilian brain, because it's like it often is something that that does things that you don't want it to do, when you react in a way that uh, you're not proud of, when do certain things that may oftentimes you're not proud of. It's usually because of the reptilian brain. um, but at the same time, we have to be extremely grateful for the reptilian brain, because it's why we're alive. Not only evolutionary, but today, like, the reptilian brain is part of what is responsible for why we breathe, while we're sleeping, and why we don't just stop breathing, right? So it's responsible for a lot of those things, like your heart pumping and breathing, but it's also responsible for the moment of decision in a lot of cases. It's a heavily influenced factor in the moment of decision. There's a lot of things being kind of weighted in the brain that's happening, but the reptilian brain makes it. So, me as a marketer, I've studied this from a consumer psychology standpoint, really understanding how consumers make decision, and this is a big aspect of that, right? But from a self-awareness standpoint, it's important to know that a lot of times when you're making a decision, even though we we say a lot of times people who are very logical think that they're making a logical decision. The part of that is based on the emotional framework that's built up that tells them that that's important and what's important and all that kind of good stuff. So, um, one of the things too I just mentioned, it's an easy thing to remember, is it's also responsible for the four F's. So fight, flight, food, and fornication, right? So some of those evolutionary instincts that are there to protect us, right? So if there's something threatening us, that we have a fight response in our body, literally, and we'll talk a little bit about the nervous system and how this comes into play. But we literally, like our sympathetic nervous system starts to go full bore, right? And we get adrenaline pumping through us and all that kind of stuff. Flight, where you have to run, right? Because it's like, okay, I better get out of here because I'm in danger, right? Food, because we need to survive, and fornication, because we need to obviously reproduce and replicate. So um, there are instinctual drivers around that. That doesn't mean that we have to um, be a slave to those drivers, right? We don't have to be controlled by those drivers. Once we start to understand them, we can actually start to change some of the patterns and become more aware and less focused by that instinct, and also realize when that instinct is happening in us and to be able to adjust and change it. So that's a really important part. You have the limbic portion of the brain, and then you have the neocortex. So the limbic is responsible for a lot of the learning and emotional connection. It's a lot of associations between pain and pleasure, right? Some emotional connections that we're creating these memories between pain and pleasure. And then you have the rational or thinking brain, the neocortex, which is responsible for verbal language and self awareness, right? This is why we can become conscious, right? We can actually metacognition, we can think about our own thoughts, we can problem solve, can do all those things. And that's a key component, a big difference between us and a lot of the other animals in our world, right? It's a big difference there. So it's important to understand, we talked about this a little bit, that the conscious mind is activated about 5% of the time. And this is actually a study done on consumer purchasing decisions that I use in some of my, from my marketing side of things, that how people make decisions, right? So it's important to understand that. But day in and day out, this is very similar to what we spend our time. We spend about 5% of our time in the conscious mind and about 95% of it in our subconscious. So that means all those patterns you've created, you're there about 95% of the time, right? That's all your past patterns. So, and there's a lot of associations and things, all that kind of stuff, right? So you're there 95% of the time. So it's really important, because most of us don't even know what's going on in that part. It's deep underneath the surface, right? And we're not really aware of it. It's important that we explore that to have the life that most of us want to have, right? Which most of us want to be able to have lives, be impactful in different ways, do different things. And as you explore that, you can start to improve the way that you interact and experience life in general. So I think a lot of people think, oh, I should be in the conscious brain, like 95% of the time, in the subconscious 5% of the time. That's not really what it is. It's not that it's bad. In fact, your subconscious is extremely powerful. If you think about all these supercomputers, our subconscious brain is more powerful than a lot of these supercomputers, processing so much information all at once. Like, it's all this stuff is going on in our subconscious brain. So it's extremely powerful. What the the change is not being in that time, and flipping those numbers. It's getting into that time, and basically reprogramming that subconscious mind in a way that is in line with your vision, right? For the how you want to experience life, your values, that what's important to you from that standpoint, and what you find purposeful. So as you start to create alignment with those in your subconscious as well, and then you direct that. And so I'll actually share a little bit of the basis around how we're going to look at that, how that's actually going to be done, so you have a better understanding. But I think it's important that you have this context, and that's that we don't see the world as it is. And if for you, it's really, really important to get this distinction and to really understand it, because I think your average person says, no, I see things and this is what it is. It's right in front of me. This is the way I see the world. But it's anyone who has done any study in psychology and perception and selective attention tests or anything like that, you start to understand that um, we don't actually, the way we see things isn't really the way things are. But we do see the world the way we are. And I'll explain why that is. A big part of that is actually what's called the reticular activating system. It's RAS for short. I say real ass shit if you want to remember that, right? So that's an easy way to remember. It's the reticular activating system. And the reticular activating system is not only responsible for like being a conscious and alert, like our level of alertness, but it's also a filter through which our attention is prioritized. And that is, prioritization is based on what our subconscious deems important or not important, right? So I'll give you a couple examples. Like, so that reptilian brain and the subconscious, they're good friends, right? So the reticular activating system is always on the lookout for, am I going to have to fight something? Am I going to have to run? Is there an opportunity for fornication? Am I hungry? Do I need food? Like, it's all those survival type instincts that are built in there. And so the way our attention works is you literally have, so in total, there's been numbers from like 11 million to 40 million bits per second that our brain and basically our brain, our whole central nervous system is kind of processing from all the data inputs from our vision, all of our sensory inputs, what we're experiencing through auditory, through touch. Vision is obviously a really big one. But so all that information that's coming in, there's ranges from 11 million to like 40 million bits per second that's processing. Where the conscious brain, what we're actually conscious of, what our attention is focused on, is usually between 40 bits and maybe 60 bits per second. So it's a very, very tiny aspect of all the information that's going on. And if you think about it, like if you were aware at all times of all the different things going on, like that would be a really horrible use of your energy. Your brain takes up more energy, like for the amount of space it takes up more energy than most of the rest of your body based on the size of what it is, right? So it takes up a lot of energy. And if we're to process all that information, like, anyways, so you get that would just be a bad evolutionary use of our resources as a whole. So once you start to understand that, you start to understand that what the reticular activating system is doing is all of that information, it's shining a light, it's drawing your attention to those things that your subconscious mind is going, hey, this is important. And so besides your survival responses, there's also the things that you've consciously deemed important in your mind. So your subconscious, this is where I'll put a big highlight here that's like, this is one of the key things that once you understand this and you can start to basically reprogram this, basically takes your supercomputer and you can actively have it working in favor for you all the time, right? So think about that, right? So right now, your supercomputer is based on all these past associations you've created. And if you've been telling yourself for a long time, if one of your patterns of things is, well, why does this always happen to me? Or why am I always getting the short end of the stick? Or, why can't I do X, Y, and Z? Your brain is trying to help you. It's going to find those reasons why you're always getting the short stick. And it's going to say, hey, here's that. Because what's crazy is that information can exist at the same time as this other information can exist of why you're not getting the short end of the stick and why you can be successful. So all that information exists out there, and it's really what we tend to put our focus our attention on. And so once you start to really get to understand that, you start to understand the power of those patterns, right? And so one of the things I say is we can be a POA, like a prisoner of war, but a POA. We're a prisoner of our attention. and our attention is controlled by our brain, our conscious, our whole system, but it's controlled by these associations that we've created in our mind that we deem important. I see I see my mother passed away in 2005, um, and I see her name on license plates every single day, like all over the place. Sometimes three, four, five, six times I see Bev on license plates. Now you may see that name sometimes too because it's a name on a license plate, and so it might stand out to you. But my brain deems a lot of importance around that, and so anytime it sees that, it's pulling that information out for me, and it's saying, "Hey, here you go." Now, you might have, other people create other associations and say, "Well, no, that's spiritual," and they're drawing your attention. There's all that kind of stuff too. But from a what we can prove in a scientific standpoint, I tend to lean towards the more like what my brain is looking for, right? And so Bev's important to me. Obviously, it's my mother's name, and so it's something that my brain's constantly looking out for. So if you're if you have a lot of limiting beliefs or patterns or stories that you're going on in your head, your brain. So many of you probably might be aware of like cognitive bias, right? Once we have a belief, we start looking for supporting belief to reinforce that, and we totally ignore anything that is counter to that. It almost, to our ego, to our self, the self we've created, it almost feels like an attack on ourself when we have a strongly held belief and there's information that's counter to that, because we were basically looking at it being as counter to us, right? It's basically challenging your worldview to some extent. So this is a whole danger, but it's also a power once you understand it. So you have to be able to be aware of that, to be able to get the benefits of both sides. One is you can train your mind to look for things that are beneficial. So your subconscious mind, if you want to be, let's just say you want to have more opportunities to have an impact in other people's lives, your subconscious mind will start working for you to find those things as you start to give it the right instructions and tell it how that's important to you, right? And I'll actually show you the biology behind this and what starts to reinforce this too, which is really exciting. I'm going to go into these in more detail in the book, but I think this is a critical element, because one of my previous episodes I talked about how if someone held the belief that you couldn't change after age 25, which was a common belief that a lot of people had for a period of time, including myself, then that could be a real roadblock to whatever you do. Because, like, well, why am I even going to try to change if I can't change, right? But there's been a lot of breakthroughs in science over the last 15, I mean, so many years, but in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot in neuroscience and understanding how the brain works that's just been tremendously helpful in our own self-awareness. One of those things is called neuroplasticity. And basically, neuroplasticity is the ability for an individual, their brain, to create new neural connections over time, right? And literally allows us to adapt and alter the structure of our brains, the actual neural connections, and strengthen them, basically, right? So it'll strengthen neural connections, or it will disconnect neural connections. So when we talk about those patterns, there's literally a reflection of those patterns in our brains through neural connections, right? Because each of those beliefs, behaviors, all those things have neural connections. You literally have like billions of neurons in your brain that are all firing and connected and creating patterns in your brain. So what's really cool about this is, for the longest time, you probably heard um, people talking about, um, like, there's been different sayings like, if you have a strong enough why, the how doesn't matter, right? Or people just focusing on the why being so important. And what I never heard, and actually, Dr. Huberman, one of the people I would suggest checking out if you want to actually dive in more with some of the real science behind this, and from I forget he's at Stanford, but he has a Huberman Lab podcast. I highly recommend checking it out. It's extremely great information. He talks a lot about how to maximize neuroplasticity, how to what different elements come into play, and all the neurochemical transmitters and everything that kind of comes into it. If you want to dive even deeper, because a lot of this stuff I can't cover at that level of expertise. I can cover the general concept and share it with you. And then if you want, it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. If you want more information on that, dive down and get more information on it. And I found it really valuable. And so when we are younger and we're developing, we have just tons and tons of information, and we're super what would be called like plastic, right? Because we are creating all these associations and we're forming these connections, and over time parts of our brain aren't using certain things, and so those things, what you don't use you lose, basically, right? So those things tend to go away, and the things that you use, those create patterns. And as we age and grow older, we become educated, right? And so by becoming educated, you've created judgments and beliefs, and you've created these neural connections, right? And so education is extremely beneficial, but it's also important to be able to continue educating and relearning and unlearning and relearning and all those kind of things. And what neuroplasticity is basically doing is saying you can unlearn and relearn, and the brain is literally saying, hey, we'll create new neural connections. And so I'll give you a couple concepts I think are important to understand about neuroplasticity. One is a common saying you'll hear if you're talking about neuroplasticity is what fires together wires together. And so dopamine is one of the key neurotransmitters in neuroplasticity. So when our brain, when we get a dopamine hit from something, right, and that is basically not, it's not a universal reward type situation. It's something we associate with a reward of some sort, right? And so a lot of people, I think of dopamine, which we'll talk about neurotransmitters a little bit more. They think of dopamine as the happy neurotransmitter and things like that, which to some extent it is, but it's even more an anticipatory. So it's anticipating happiness is the reward. It's not the receiving of happiness. You'll get a spike of dopamine as well, but the anticipation is actually really big. And so what's really cool about that is when your brain says, "Oh, hey, we just got dopamine," it will start to say, "Okay, let's make that connection," because that means that if we do that again, which makes us more efficient at doing that, we will get more dopamine, right? And that's ultimately that goal of that neurotransmitter, and that connection is saying, okay, this is signaling us to wire this way because the brain is telling me that this is pleasure. I'm into pleasure going this way, right? So, and there's a lot of nuances in there, and so I don't want to dive too deep because there's so many different aspects between pain and pleasure and how we associate those things and all that kind of stuff. But I do think it's really important to understand that one of the things that happen to people a lot is they set a goal, right? And they go out there and they achieve that said goal, and they get to that, and then they kind of fall off, and they're like, okay, well, I achieved this thing. I should, like, be super excited, and like all this kind of stuff. And there might have been some excitement and celebration and things like that, but then it's like, okay, well, what's the next goal going after that, right? And that's kind of a common thing. It's a common thing you hear amongst people, especially those that are really driven people, and there's ways that they utilize that to keep that drive, and there's all that kind of stuff. I won't get too far down that road right now, but it's and I found this to be very true. It's more effective, and it tends to create in my opinion, it tends to create a better life experience if rather than tying so much, um, having such an association with the end result that you're putting off pleasure to that end point to where you get it and it just goes up and then goes down, that all the ordinary things that you do every single day that will get you to those points, that you actually associate pleasure with those things. So these are like when we talk about like process oriented goals. Like sometimes I'll talk about being goals. Like what goals do you have for just being? Like how do you want to be? Right? Like how do you want to be this day? Do you want to be happy? Do you want to be healthy? Do you want to be kind? Do you want to be compassionate? Do you want to be patient? Do you want to, like, what are the ways of being that you value? So having being goals and having process goals and understanding that those ordinary things done every single day, if done consistently, produce those extraordinary results. And so what you tend to get is you tend to get like excited in doing all those things, and you are actually, you get a much better result because you're doing all those ordinary things as opposed to often putting them off because you're like, yeah, I'm excited about this thing over here, but I'm not excited about all these things in front of me. Those do not bring me pleasure. Maybe a little bit because I know it's going to get me there, but not as much. But if you can change that association, that is a game changer from a performance standpoint, from a follow through standpoint, regardless of whether it's wanting to have an impact, whether it's wanting to grow a business, whether it's wanting to build a relationship, whatever that is, it's those ordinary things done every single day. And so one of the things, and actually, Dr. Himmelman was the first time I heard this, and to me, it was a light bulb moment because I've heard so many people, and I've known the power of having a strong why for a long time, but I didn't know the science, the actual biology behind that, and why that was so important. And so, what's actually crazy to me is, and he shared some of this information, and I can probably try to find the actual episode and link to the portion where he talked about this, but basically, in some of the studies around what increased plasticity and allowed for change, um, it's going to sound so simple, but it was having a strong enough reason why, right? Like, there's so many examples of people who've had things happen in their life where all of a sudden it's like they had to make serious changes and they made those changes. And, and there's those people that for the longest time say, oh no, I can't do that, I can't do that, I can't do that, and then something happens, and it's like, oh, they do all those things because there was a strong enough motivating reason why for them to do it. So what's cool about that is we can create that within ourselves without having to go through some big event or some traumatic event. We don't need to do those things. Now, it can be that can be effective agent of change, right? We know from going through this pandemic, like this huge change that happened, we all had to shift and change in different ways. And because we were forced to, like, we probably wouldn't have made some of those changes otherwise, whether it be businesses, individuals, or whatever, right? Probably wouldn't have made some of those changes, but we were forced to make those changes. And by doing that, now we've created new connections, new pathways, and different ways of doing things as a organization, as a society, as an individual. So these all connect at different levels, the way I think of them, at least. So I think that that's a really exciting connection for me. It makes me understand even deeper. And so when you hear me talk about slow time, what I'm talking about doing is getting really aligned with that why, and then letting you, like, for me, I'm not saying this is going to work for everybody, but for me, whether it's an individual project, whether it's whatever it may be, if I can get in my mind and get really aligned with like the why behind that, like the feeling that I'm going to feel once that's done, whatever that daily thing is, or whether like getting excited about some of the things I want to do that day and just really having that why very clear in my mind, now rather than feel like I'm having to push myself through some of those things, I literally get pulled through those things in a way that I actually enjoy doing them, and I'm feeling pulled through them, and I think the work that I do is better. I think my focus is better, my attention is better, and all those things, right? So there's some key elements there that I think for most people are going to be extremely impactful once you dive deeper and really understand those. Pardon me. So this is just kind of a chart to kind of show. We don't need to get into the details of all that stuff. You don't need to understand, axons and myelin sheaths and all that kind of stuff, right? But you can. I mean, it gives you a little um, better understanding and better context, I think, of some of those things that are happening. But just understand that when I'm talking about the riverbed and these patterns, there's literally biological tributaries, which are these neural connections that are being created all the time. Those are all the little patterns, right? Those are all the little tributaries that make up that riverbed of your life, right? Those are the patterns, and as we go through those patterns, what we associate pain and pleasure with, right? We guide that. That's what creates those patterns, and over time, we continue doing those, and we repeat, and it strengthens those patterns. So that's the general concept. Now, um, the I think having some context around the our neurochemical system, how neurotransmitters work to some extent so we talked a little bit about dopamine and how dopamine um, makes like what fires together, wires together, and what makes those connections in those neural connections, because dopamine's transmitting and it's firing those connections. But there's so many other neurochemicals as well, and it's important to kind of understand. Once you start understanding some of these things, you can actually actively control them. And I'll give you a few I guess tips, simple stuff. What's insane about this is once you understand the simplicity of some of this stuff, and then you start to see that it works, it kind of blows your mind. And I'm just speaking from my own experience, but I know a lot of other people um, have had similar experiences. So I have a high level of confidence that if you work through some of these different elements, that you'll start to see similar results as well if you just do some of them consistently. And so things like dopamine, serotonin, there's oxytocin, which is some people call the love neurochemical, right? So there's oh gosh, there's tons of different neurochemicals, but I think that it's really important. Again, uh, Dr. Andrew Huberman does some great insights into all the neurochemicals, understanding like how our nervous system comes out, and how stress and cortisol and all the stuff kind of comes into our system when we get into those fight or flight modes, how that actually negatively impacts our health, like lowers our immune system, and changes our state, which is something I'll dive into more as well. It actually literally makes us less resourceful as we get into some of those, like if we get into the sympathetic nervous system and we're feeling like in that fight or flight kind of mode, like we actually become less resourceful. We're just kind of running, but can't solve complex problems at that time. So anyways, I think that that's a really important element to kind of understand. One of the things you'll hear me talk a lot about, I'll probably do a whole entire episode on, is gratitude, and how just doing some work around gratitude is really important, because some of the elements of gratitude seem counterintuitive. So for me, as someone who is driven building a business, I sometimes put off what I considered pleasure. I put off satisfaction because I felt power in dissatisfaction. I felt drive and dissatisfaction because there was hunger there, right? And so if I was satisfied, then I wasn't hungry. It was kind of the subconscious guide that was going on there, and it was like I need to be driven. But I got to a point where I would say that wasn't quite working for me, and I had to explore that at a deeper level. But what was crazy for me is once I actually started to really utilize gratitude and focus on gratitude and make it part of some of my daily routines and different elements that I did. And then I understood the science behind it. So gratitude actually, dopamine and serotonin are playing there. So dopamine is literally working on creating those new neural connections, and serotonin is like That's your feeling of fulfillment. That's your feeling of being whole, so serotonin is more of the satisfaction. So these feel counterintuitive, but serotonin is more of like feeling satisfied and just feeling fulfilled and well-being and just all that kind of stuff. And dopamine is more of like motivation of like, I want to go get that thing over there and anticipating reward of it. Right. So they're kind of counterintuitive, but once you what happens is when you are grateful for something, it literally signals in your brain. And so you have that feeling of fulfillment of being grateful for it. But your brain is also going, you know what? I'm grateful for that. So I should make sure that I'm continuing to look out for that. And so I'm going to send some dopamine signals here too, so that anytime this comes up in the future, we're more efficient at getting that. So if you are showing gratitude for the things in your life that are important, your relationship with your spouse, your clients, the work you do, your business, your friends, your own health, right? As opposed to being negative about certain aspects and talking negatively about it, which focuses on resentment. If you're more grateful for that, it literally is saying, hey, I'll keep an eye out for making sure that we're taking care of this, right? Like your subconscious brain starts actually working in that direction. And so that to me is like literally one of the cheat codes of life is gratitude and just understanding how that impacts it. It's also when you understand what you reward yourself for, it's really important that you understand. So when you think about neurochemicals, there's a whole reward system that's kind of going on there. And so you want to be careful about what you reward, because if you reward things that those actions lead to somewhere you don't want to be, then you're reinforcing that by rewarding that. And rewards can come in many different fashions. They don't have to be physical rewards. They can be mental rewards just because you're associating a reward with that. And so what's counterintuitive, and this is where the past, present, future kind of come into play, and having a little bit of that delayed gratification comes into play, is it's important to have that vision, because otherwise there's often pain in front of us. And so if we have a vision over here, there means we have to grow in some way, because this vision, we're not there, right? So there's things that we're not doing, things that we're not being, they're over here. That means we have to change, which means we're uncomfortable to some extent. Not always, but we're not currently doing it, right? We're not being it, we're not having it, whatever that element is. And so it's really important in that standpoint to not just look at this final destination, but to look at the things that are right in front of you. When you have that vision, then you can actually start to associate things with what you were associating was painful before. Maybe that was going to work out and exercise, right? Because there's work there, and like it takes time. I have to get up, I have to go there, like you're all this. You can actually start to have positive associations with that, because your vision is not focused right here, it's focused over here. And you realize that you're rewarding yourself, and you have good associations around that, and you're rewarding yourself and feeling good about that thing that you're doing every day, because it's getting you to your vision over here. So there's a lot here, but I think the biology aspect is such an important context to have, because once you start to understand, so there's this feedback loop that goes both ways between um, our way of being, right, our state, our beliefs, and then our actual body. Sometimes we feel like we're having an emotion, and it signals to our body. And there's other times where our body is experiencing something and it's signaling to our brain. And so there's literally kind of a feedback loop, and that goes both ways. You can literally take your attention and put it on something over here, and you can start to feel a certain way. You can also feel a certain way, and it signals to your brain, and the way you interpret that and the way your body's experiencing something can signal to your brain that you're feeling a certain way. So there's a lot of easy tricks. There's breathing, there's movement, there's body posture. Obviously, there's your diet and exercise and all that kind of stuff as well. It's a really important part of taking care, and you know being grateful for our body that supports us, and treating it in the way that you know is worthy of that gratefulness and that gratitude that of the way we're doing it. But what I want to share with you are some like things that are like immediate, which is in to me is like I said, it's crazy. Some of the breathing elements, and this there's some things for I think people that have anxiety. I think this is important for everyone, regardless, depending on how you're breathing. So if you think about it, I think this is kind of funny, but if you think about it, if you weren't breathing, what would happen? Yeah, you'd die, right? Breathing is such an important aspect for us, but when do you think when was the last time you thought about your breathing and how that impacted your life? So there's literally ways that you can breathe, and there's multiple. If you look up like breath work and different things like that, you can do a whole deep dive in these areas. So there's a lot of more gold nuggets to find in all these areas. But I'll give you a couple examples on the breathing side of things. So um, if we, depending on how we breathe, our inhale, our exhale, whether it's in our diaphragm, like how we're, by all that kind of stuff changes. Like you can literally get more energy just by the way you breathe. Because a lot of times, so, and actually, here's a perfect analogy, a little story that I was a while back. I was getting in really good shape. I was actually training for a Spartan race, and I was starting to run more, and I kept getting to like 2.5, 2.8 miles. I was trying to get to past the 3 mile mark, and I just seemed to be like a barrier for me. And I was just like, oh man, like I was trying to figure out what can help me get past that? Like, how can I get past that? And I was thinking, like, my legs are getting tired. I was thinking about all these different things. And I started thinking about how I was breathing. And I started thinking about the energy. And I did a lot of research around that for, I say a lot. Quick, I started researching different things about breathing, all that kind of stuff. And so the only thing I changed, and this was literally in one day, when I went out and ran the next time, I tried this method, and it was breathing in through the nose, quick 3 short breaths. So, and it was with the pace of my run. It was, and so as I was running, and I was just consistent with that kind of breathing. I went from not being able to go over 3 miles to running a little over 5 miles that day. Like that's how much breathing has an impact, right? And it's because our oxygen eventually, we obviously get ATP, we get energy, and ultimately what was happening is I was running out because my breathing wasn't providing me with enough energy to go past that point. And so once I started to do better breathing techniques as I was doing that, I made this huge leap, which made me go, oh, breathing is apparently really important. And so other aspects, and I'll talk a little bit about the nervous system next. And the way our breathing impacts our nervous system is really important. If we start to get nervous or anxious, and we want to calm down, or if you're trying to go to bed, or basically when you have a longer exhale than inhale. So when you exhale longer than your inhale, it sends a signal and your heart actually slows down. What people tell people to do when something's going on is they're like, just breathe, and they're breathing, and it actually speeds up their heart rate because um, they're taking these big deep breaths in, and then like, and then in, and then out, right? And it's a big deep breath in and then a short breath out, which actually sends a signal to your heart rate to increase. And so if you want to get into what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, which easy way for me to remember it, took me a little while, but was to use para like parachute. It slows you down, right? The parachute, parasympathetic slows you down, right? It goes poof, and it kind of lets you fall more slowly. The sympathetic nervous system is like the gas pedal, and the parasympathetic is the brake. It slows you down a little bit. So a simple one is you breathe in for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4 as you breathe in, and then you hold for 7 seconds. You just hold that breath, keep it in for 7, and then release for 8. doing that 3 to 5 times, like if you just do that now, if you just pause this and just did that now and you breathed in, just that alone changes your nervous system. It sends signals to your body. And so it's that using that feedback loop both ways. So you can help guide your state. You can help feel better. You can be more healthy. There's so many different benefits of that. And that's only one. Like I like to use, what's it called? Well, normally what I do is it's, so it's 1-4-2, but that's basically like it's 1-4-2. But what I normally do is just use the, not denominator, I don't know what it's called, but like, so what I would do is instead of 1-4-2, it would be like 4-16-8, right? So that's one of the ones I like to do. That is also another one for relaxation. You're basically doing 4 seconds in, you're doing a much longer hold for 16 seconds, and then 8 seconds out, right? So that's another one I like to do. If you're trying to if you're trying to be more alert and speed things up, there's different breath work you can do there too. Movement is this is kind of a weird one, but I think once you learn like body movement and you learn how powerful this is, you can use your body and move it in all sorts of different directions and be silly and playful or dance and do these different things. And it just has this huge impact on the way you feel. And it's crazy, but especially men are going to have a harder time with some of this because you know, um, I think it's important to reframe strength in a lot of ways, and that's been something that's helpful for me. Is for me, um, the way I look at strength is a little bit differently than maybe some people do. But for me, it's being able to really have a deeper understanding of myself so that I can be my best self. First of all, and part of that is being strong enough to realize when I have something inside of me that is um, telling me that maybe I'm nervous of the way people think of me, or I have this old way of thinking that was based on a really past association about what people might think of me, and what it means to be a man, and what all that kind of stuff. So where did this come in? Like when did I get it? And so I look at strength as that's to me is a much stronger element because I feel I can be a much better leader that way. I can be a much better husband, father, friend, all those different aspects. And so, but like movement of the body, some men probably feel less comfortable with that, and that's fine. All these things, you know, is about starting to become uncomfortable with being comfortable because you're never going to get outside your comfort zone without getting into the uncomfortable zone. So it's over time, if you want to consistently grow and continue to grow, it's about learning to get a little more uncomfortable, a little more uncomfortable. Body posture it seems so crazy, but it's extremely impactful. Whether you're just standing up straight and having really good posture and like feeling like there's someone's pulling you up by a string at the middle of your head and having walk into a room with a smile, or whether it's there's the power pose, whether it's whether it's doing the Captain Jack, whatever it is. Like you can do things that are like silly or fun, or that just get you in whatever mood or state that you're trying to do. So you can use your body, use your physiology, your biology to send signals to your brain to do that. So that's a huge part. And so I think it's important to understand some basic understanding of the central nervous system. We talked about this a little bit, the parasympathetic, the sympathetic, and the parasympathetic being the brake to some extent that slows us down like a parachute. right? And then the sympathetic being more of the gas, right? So our pupils will dilate, our heart rate rises, all those kind of things happen as part of that. And so what ends up happening is a lot of times people have developed patterns and they actually have, in some ways, have good associations with them, especially someone who's used um, some of this kind of energy in a way that's benefited them, right? Because they get really worked up and then they get things done. They make people do things in a certain way, and that's really worked well for them. You know, me being one of them at different times in my life, I would let stress drive me into a certain way, and then I would be doing other things which would breed stress in other people, depending on how I did it, which you can associate, there's ways you can associate positivity with that because you're like, well, we're getting things done, we're making things happen. But what at least I've experienced is by being able to control this more effectively, I'm much more effective at problem solving and not overreacting in certain situations and making sure that I'm also more aware and being more compassionate to our team, to our customers, being aware of what's going on rather than reacting based on my, you know, instinctual fear that may be related to whatever thing, right? Whatever that thing is that is happening for you or somebody else. But there's a lot here that comes into this, and I think once you understand that and how the central nervous system and the brain and all that kind of work together and how you can actually guide that significantly by your breathing and your body movement, all those different things, it's huge. One of the other things we're going to talk about too, um, and I'm going to do a whole episode just on this because I think it's such a critical component, is slow down to speed up. So I started saying this, well, say maybe 3 years ago. I started saying this over and over. And actually, our our COO at Web4, Jason Wright, we'd always have strategy discussions about different things, the way we were doing things, and we would. And he kind of brought up the idea of um, there's times where we needed to slow down to assess if what we were doing was the most effective and efficient way and benefited and was aligned with our values and all the things we were doing as an organization, so that would ultimately help us speed up. And so I loved what he was saying, and I took that and I started saying that to myself because I saw within myself um, opportunities to do the same. Like, how can I slow down in certain instances and assess the way I'm responding, the different patterns I have, so that ultimately I can be more effective and speed up, right? Because ultimately, sometimes it's like if someone is doing the wrong thing really fast, it's not going to get them anywhere, right? So it's about slowing down to make sure you're doing more of the right thing that aligns with, who you want to be and how you want to be, and all those different elements, right? And so um, this we'll talk about this more too. This is more of just kind of a teaser for probably I'll go into this more in the next episode. But when we talk about autopilot and manual, we're talking to some extent about being in the subconscious, or sometimes some people may refer to it as unconscious, being on autopilot, right? And then being able to downshift into manual mode. That's where you're slowing down and being able to downshift into manual mode when you need to become more conscious at that point. And I'll actually share with you an acronym, and we'll dive into this in the next episode, called STEAR, STEAR, which is stimulus, thought, emotion, action, and result. And so using that model to kind of assess. So we have autopilot manual and we have steer, so we can learn to steer in the direction. So ultimately, you can work backwards too, because you can say, what is the result I want? And you can kind of work backwards in that order and start to go, hey, how would this come out better? What would be a better action in this case? And how would the emotion that I'm feeling here, what is it, the thought that I'm having? And then how can I change that thought so that I can be more effective in my emotion and my action so that I get that result that I'm looking for? And how can I change the stimulus? So I'll dive deep into that because I think that that's a critical component. You can't, there's one of the other books, and I'm not remembering his name right now, but it's called Thinking Fast and Slow. So he talks a lot about that. I think of it a little bit more of a spectrum, I think. And I don't think they're bad things, right? I don't think autopilot's a bad thing. In fact, you need autopilot to be successful. Um, the way we go and drive, we want to be able to drive a car and not have to relearn every single time how we're driving that car, right? But, if you're a NASCAR driver, you may want to actually look at those little things a little more closely, right? But if we're talking about our the patterns we've developed of thought, of emotion, of action, we can start to look and go, hey, I do this, I get into this pattern of thought, which creates this emotion, which creates this action sometimes, and that's happening, and so being able to downshift, being able to assess that, and being able to reposition that, so we go, how do we create this new pattern, this new neural connections, this new riverbed that's going to support me, my thoughts, emotions, and actions to go in the direction that I want them to. So I'm excited to jump into that part next. And for me, that was, oops. Yep. Anyways, I had a little blip there, but now I'm back. I was gonna say, for me, that's all I had today to go over on biology. As I go into the book, I'll definitely provide a little more context and detail in some of the different areas. But if you have any questions in the meantime, and let me know. I mean, it'll help inform and make sure I'm communicating things in a way that are helpful. And if there's areas that I can add more value, I really want to know so that I can put that in the book and hopefully get this information to as many people as possible. So with that, thank you so much. Have a great day.